Hi, my name is John, and this is the video lecture for Ling 105 on linguistic relativity. Linguistic relativity is the fairly controversial idea that the language that you speak has some significant effect on your cognition or perception, or your understanding of the outside world in general. Um, and the implication is that people who speak different languages, especially people who have different first languages, actually see the world differently because of the languages that they speak. As you can imagine, this is a pretty controversial idea. Some people see it very clearly. They see big differences in languages that correspond to differences in culture and make the leap that the difference in the language is actually what creates some differences in culture among different groups of people. Other people think that this idea is complete nonsense and there is no substance to it whatsoever. And so, like most interesting theories that are controversial, there's probably a little bit of truth to it, and it's probably not absolutely correct. One thing that we want to do really quickly is distinguish linguistic relativity from a kind of stronger version of the same idea that's often referred to as linguistic determinism. Linguistic determinism is an idea that your cognition or thoughts are strictly determined by the language that you speak. In other words, you can't think of things that your language does not give you the word for. This is sometimes referred to as the prison cage of language. And nobody, no serious linguist or anthropologist or academic really takes this idea seriously anymore. People did at one point, but nobody really believes that the language that you speak completely determines what you're able to think about. But there are quite a lot of people throughout the years that have entertained some version of the idea of linguistic relativity, that differences in the languages that we speak has some effect on the way that we see and think about the world. So we're going to talk about a lot of different aspects of this idea in this video today. But I want to start by pointing out that the reason that we're talking about linguistic relativity in this class on language endangerment is the fact that linguistic relativity, or some version of that idea, is actually somewhat important in language revitalization. And the belief that different languages actually do give you different worldviews, they give you different insights into the world, is actually a major motivator for a lot of language revitalization programs. And a lot of people in endangered language communities actually latch onto this idea quite seriously because it gives them reason to want to revitalize their language. So give you just a few quotes from various people that have said something along these lines. This first one is from a study by Nicholas 2009, who did some interviews with teenage learners of the Hopi language. Hopi is an indigenous language spoken on the Hopi Reservation in Arizona. It's not a super endangered language, but a lot of Hopi kids do not grow up speaking the language. And the study interviewed teenagers who were learning the language for the first time as teenagers. One of these teenagers, named Dorian, it's like a anonymous name for the study, said the following. She said, "We have to learn the language because my mom tells me there are some things you can't learn in English because it's just hard to explain it in English. Like me, I'm learning the basic cultural things we Hopi people do in English, but if you don't know it, the Hopi language, you don't really understand the Hopi culture." So what Dorian here is saying is that there's some things that you really just cannot understand if you try and understand it in English, but you can if you try and understand it in the Hopi language. Roger Spielman is a Native American Studies professor in Canada who learned the Ojibwe language of Canada, an indigenous language of Canada, as an adult. And he said, if a person has his or her language and identity, it can go a long way in preventing assimilation into another culture and in preserving tradition-specific ways of relating to others, be they human or other than human persons. The philosophy, worldview, spirituality, and culture-specific ways of thinking and doing things of a people are built right into the very structure of their language. It is a route, learning languages, to seeing history in an alternate way of reconstructing a more accurate and representative picture of history. So that's a pretty strong statement, right? That's a very linguistic relativity kind of statement when he says that the culture-specific ways of thinking and doing things of a people are built right into the very structure of their language. Right. Final quote is from Haunani K. Trask, who's a Kanaka Maoli activist and professor at the University of Hawaii. She says, thinking in one's own cultural reference, here referring primarily to the Hawaiian language, leads to conceptualizing in one's own worldview, which in turn leads to disagreement with and eventual opposition to the dominant ideology. So what she's saying here is not just about like individual cognition of the world or understanding your own culture, but that speaking one's own native language, the traditional language of your community, actually has political consequences, right? That you will see the world differently and you will change your political views accordingly. So in all of these, what we see is different versions of this idea that language, and the language that you speak and being able to speak in the language traditional to your community actually gives you access to a way of seeing the world that is fundamentally different and has real world consequences, right? It will change your behavior. It'll change the way that you relate to your community. And so although there's a lot of controversy about linguistic relativity and how true it is, how legit of an idea it is, it's certainly an idea that is motivating for people who are interested in revitalizing a language that has lost speakers. So in this presentation today, I'm going to do a few things. First, since we're talking about differences in language leading to differences in worldview or thought, we need to know a little bit about how languages can be different in the first place. We're going to talk about the history of this idea of linguistic relativity, and we're going to look a little bit at the kind of modern evidence, right? So where does this question stand as of today in 2020? And finally, we're going to look at some issues related to language and social reality, and then we're going to kind of summarize there at the end. So first, I want to take a few minutes to look at ways that languages can be different, which obviously this is going to be an abridged version of this topic, since answering this question is kind of like one of the reasons for the entire field of linguistics. Understanding the ways that languages can be different is a very complex topic and something that has been interesting to lots of different people for a very long time. I'm going to focus on a few ideas here. So one is that languages can have differences in their sounds. That's a very quick and easy thing to understand. Another is that languages can have differences in their lexicon, meaning their vocabulary. Languages can be different in terms of their grammatical structures. And finally, I'm going to give a couple examples of how languages can differ in how those other two pieces, the lexicon and the grammar, are related to one another. So first, sound systems I include here, and I hope you like my really bad visual pun. I include here because it's just a very easy thing to understand very quickly, right? The different languages have different sound inventories. You have sounds in some languages and sound distinctions in some languages that you just don't in others, right? So for example, you may have heard something at some point in your life about so-called click languages in Southern Africa. These are languages in the Khoisan language family, which is spoken across several countries in the southern part of Africa. And in these languages, people have sounds like and built into the sound structure of their language, the same way that in English we use sounds like pa and ta and ka. And that's pretty easy to see that that's a big difference in your language, right? But despite all the different sounds that might show up in various human languages around the world, they are all constrained by the fact that they have to be sounds that the human vocal tract can actually produce, right? So there's maybe some things that are kind of out there and they don't show up in a lot of languages, but they are still something that any human could produce if they took the time to learn how to do it, right? So if you hear somebody speaking a click language and they're making sounds like or that might seem totally alien to you, but you have a human vocal tract and you could do it if you spend the time to learn how to do it. So when people are talking about linguistic relativity, though, they're talking more about things like lexical and grammatical differences and how those might shape the way that speakers of different languages might see the world differently. For lexical differences, I'll give you what is probably the most common topic in linguistic relativity, which is the issue of color and different inventories of color terms in different languages. So here in the picture on your screen, you've got kind of four little color swatches, not swatches, four color swatches that I, as an English speaker, would describe as something like light green or maybe like lime green, a dark green, a dark blue, and a light blue, right? So I can distinguish with my language the differences between those two different kinds of greens. I can say like light green and dark green, but they're both fundamentally just a type of green, right? Likewise with the blues, there's a dark blue and a light blue. I can say it's a sky blue, something like that. Maybe the dark is a navy blue. We have lots of descriptive terms, but at the end of the day, there are just different shades of blue, right? Now in Russian, those two English blues are actually two completely different colors, the same way that the two greens and the two blues on the screen are completely different colors for English speakers. So in Russian, you do not have dark blue and light blue. Instead, you have, and I will butcher this, Siny and Goluboy. Two completely different colors, right? You can probably tell pretty easily just by looking at the words that they are not related. They're not just like the same base word with modifiers. They're completely different colors to a Russian speaker. So on the other side of the coin, you have a language like Japanese, which looks at all four of these colors, these different greens and these different blues, and says that's all just variations on one color, right? So the Japanese color ao is often translated as English blue, but for most Japanese speakers, the range of shades that can be fit into the ao category expands, covers pretty much anything that an English speaker would call blue, but also a lot of things that an English speaker would call green. Now, if you've ever studied Japanese, or if you're a Japanese speaker, you might be thinking on the top of your head, well, what about midori? So like I took Japanese, and when I learned Japanese colors, I learned that ao was blue and midori was green, right? But especially traditionally, midori refers to like one very narrow shade of green, kind of like a light lime green. And in fact, the word originally referred not to a color, but to the like fresh shoots on a plant, right? So if you think about like a bamboo shoot that's just starting to like spread up out of the ground, that quick bright green growth at the edge of the bamboo shoot, that's the color that midori is. And then in fact is what the word actually originally referred to. And so ao as a category covers a much bigger span of colors than either English green or English blue. And so the same way that the Japanese category of ao is broken up in English into green and blue, the English category of blue is broken up in Russian into siny and goluboy. So all humans, right, for the most part, see the same visible light spectrum, right? Obviously, if you're colorblind, you see fewer colors. A very small percentage of women are tetrachromats. They have like an extra cone in their retina that lets them see like a slightly larger range of colors. But for the most part, everybody has the same access to the same visible light spectrum of colors, right? But the point is that different languages take that same gradient spectrum of colors and kind of cut it up differently, right? That you can make dividing lines in different places is the core idea of how lexical differences might affect how people see the world. And so the question is, if these languages have different color categories, does that affect the way that the speakers of the different languages might view and perceive the color of objects? That, if that can be proven, if that can be shown to be true, would be an instance of linguistic relativity. We'll come back to that idea in a little bit. Languages can obviously have a huge difference in terms of their vocabulary, but languages can also have a lot of difference in terms of their grammatical structures. I'm going to give you just two, one pretty simple and one slightly more complicated example. So one easy way to see that languages are different is in their basic word order. So basic word order refers to the way in which a language puts together these three components, the subject and the object of a sentence and the verb of a sentence. So we're looking for verbs that have both a subject and an object. So like in English, when I say John eats cheese, I have a subject, John, I have a verb, eats, and I have an object, cheese. And pretty much any English sentence has this pattern, right? You always have the subject first, then the verb, and then the object. Now, if you go to Korean, you don't say John eats cheese. You, in fact, say something like, and I'll butcher this as well, John은 치즈를 먹는다, which is not John eats cheese, but John cheese eats. So in Korean, as with Japanese is like this as well, the verb always goes at the end of the sentence. And so the basic word order is usually the subject, then the object, and then the verb. There's still other patterns. So some languages like Hawaiian actually always put the verb at the beginning of the sentence. So the same kind of three pieces in Hawaiian, rather than John eats cheese or John cheese eats, get formatted in Hawaiian as Ayo Johnny Kawaii Pa'a, eats John cheese. You have verb, subject, object. Even still, right? So you have variation between languages about the basic order of elements in a simple sentence like that. But you might even have some languages where the order itself isn't really grammatically important or grammatically determined in the first place. So these two examples are from a language called Untitled Chapter, which is a language that I study for my graduate research that's spoken in Paraguay. It's an indigenous language of Paraguay. And in Untitled Chapter, the verb, like Hawaiian, always comes first in the sentence. But unlike in Hawaiian, where the verb comes first and then you always have the subject and then an object, the order of the two pieces after the verb is not really of any kind of grammatical importance to the grammar of Untitled Chapter. It really doesn't matter. What the difference between the first one, eats John cheese or aptamchik John queso, and the second one, aptamchik queso John eats cheese John, the only difference between these two sentences is not that in the latter one the cheese is eating John, but no, the difference between the two of them is just about which of the two things, John or cheese, is kind of more newsworthy. Which of them is a new thing in the conversation in which this sentence shows up. So for example, if you were already talking about cheese, if you were in a conversation about cheese and you want to say, oh yeah, John eats cheese, and John was the new information, then you would use the first one. You would say, aptamchik John queso. Whereas if you were already talking about John, if he was the topic of conversation, and you wanted to add this new information that he eats cheese, you would probably pick the second order. You say aptamchik queso John. So how languages order these pieces changes a lot, and whether or not the order even matters that much in the first place, at least grammatically, can also be different across languages. So the second example that I want to give you is an example of a difference in what linguists call alignment, which can be a very complicated topic, but if you stick with me, I think you'll understand the point here. So in English, you may never have thought about this before, but there is a grammatical difference between the word I and the word me, right? They both mean the same thing, right? They both mean this guy right here, the person talking. But I is used when it is the subject of a sentence, and me is used when it is the object of a sentence. And so when you have the subject of a intransitive verb, a verb that only has a subject and no object, you say I slept. And then if you have a transitive verb with an object, you say I saw you, but then you saw me, right? You don't say you saw I. It's I and me are different because one is used in the subject position and one is used for objects. So we can say that in English, these two things, the subject of an intransitive verb and the subject of a transitive verb, are aligned. They match, and they are in opposition to the object of the transitive verb here, me. Now, if you look at a language like Yucatec Maya, you see in some of their verbs at least, essentially the opposite alignment pattern. So in Yucatec Maya, the same three sentences, I slept, I saw you, you saw me, are I slept, huenelen, and the ain here is the I part. This part means huenel means sleep and an means I. And then when you say I saw you, that is tin willy ketch. The tin is the I saw you, and the etch here, it's not in a box, but that's the you part. And then when you say you saw me, you say ta willy ken. So here the an is the you saw me part, and the an refers to me. So here, what you see is instead of like in English where the subject of this sleep verb matches with the subject of the see verb and is different from the object of the see verb, in Yucatec Maya, the subject of that sleep verb matches the object of the see verb and not the subject of the see verb. That would be kind of like if in English, instead of saying I slept, we said me slept, and I saw you, you saw me. So the alignment between these different pieces is different in these two languages. Now you may be thinking, okay, so how does that lead to linguistic relativity? Well, some people have looked at these kinds of differences and said, okay, well, if English has this kind of alignment where the subject, where the sleeper is marked the same as the seer and different from the thing that is seen, and then the opposite is true in Yucatec Maya, does that mean that English speakers actually think of the sleeper as being more like the seer, and that Maya speakers think of the sleeper as being more like the thing that is being seen, right? The grammar of the two languages has that difference. Does that mean that the way that people in those two languages think about the world is also different in a way that reflects that grammatical difference? It's a very complicated question, a lot of different ideas about it, but that is the kind of relationship that linguistic relativity wants to answer, that linguistic relativity is looking to figure out, right? Is if this kind of grammatical distinction actually affects the way that people think about and see the world. I'll give you one more example of difference that is related to the way that different lexical items, different parts of a language's vocabulary might be put into different grammatical categories. Here I'm saying the grammatical specs, but what I mean is the grammatical categories of the word. So for example, in English, we have a sentence like, it is raining. Raining is the verb, and in English, we have to do this thing where, well, we have a verb to be in a sentence needs a subject, so what's raining? It is. Even though the it doesn't really refer to anything at all, right? It's kind of a dummy subject. You could say that the rain is raining, but no English speaker would actually say that, right? But it's just because rain here is a verb that it has to have a dummy subject. Now, differently in English, we do not say, when we talk about wind, we do not say it is winding, right? Wind in English is exclusively a noun. Rain is one of those weird words that kind of has a noun form and a verb form, but the word wind can only be a noun. And so we cannot say it is winding or the wind is winding. I have to say something like the wind is blowing, right? So there's a thing, the wind, and it's doing something, it's blowing. But other languages, like this example from Inflet Sur, the language that I mentioned a few minutes ago, that's an indigenous language of Paraguay. To say the wind is blowing, they say a single verb, which basically, if you want to translate it literally, is you would translate this literally as it is winding, which again you can't do in English, but is exactly what you do in Inflet Sur. So when you have this kind of difference, does that mean that English speakers tend to see the wind or wind more as a thing that does something, and that the movement of the wind is distinct from the wind because our grammar forces us to say it that way, and that Inflet Sur speakers actually think of wind more as a process because it's a verb and not a noun? I don't know. That's kind of what would that really mean? That's kind of an abstract question to ask in the first place. But this is the kind of question that investigations into linguistic relativity are asking. They're saying, okay, so these languages think of, English thinks of wind as a noun. Inthlit thinks of wind as a verb. Does that mean that these people that speak these different languages actually have different conceptions of what wind is? That's the kind of question that we're looking at here. So just to summarize that, languages can be different in so many ways that we really don't have the time to even scratch the surface on here. But they can be obvious. They can be different in very obvious ways, like having different sounds. But they can be different in ways that might take you a little time to pick out and understand. So they can have differences in their vocabulary. You might have words that exist in one language that don't really have a good, quick, easy translation in another language, or they might have a range of meanings that don't match up exactly with the words in another language. Different languages can have differences in grammar, and different languages can have differences in how various parts of the vocabulary get used grammatically. So whole lot of difference there. In this next part of this presentation, I want to talk a little bit about the history of this idea of linguistic relativity. So at this point, we've seen the types of differences in languages that have led some people to think that they must correspond to differences in the way that speakers of different languages see the world. But this idea has gone through a lot of different iterations throughout time. There have been some times when lots of very preeminent scholars in their field thought that it was right on the money, and other times when people have thought that this idea was bogus and completely ridiculous. The idea of linguistic relativity, specifically, especially that term, refers to a academic discussion that has gone on in Western academia primarily for really about 100 years, maybe more than that, depending on what you include or not. But some version of this idea, right? Some idea about the relationship between language and thought, and how language and thought correspond to reality, that which exists outside of us as humans. Some version of an idea about the relationship between those three things has been present in probably every human culture ever, right? This is something that people tend to want to think about, right? When I talk about something, how good are my words at describing what's actually going on? Is what I'm saying actually the same as what is real, right? Do my words have real value? Do they correspond to things that are real in the world, or are they just words? There's been a whole lot of variation in the ideas surrounding this kind of relationship between language and thought and reality. One category of ideas related to this topic are what we might call holistic views, in which language is kind of integrated into other parts of reality and is not something that is really like separate, right? So for example, in many Aboriginal Australian communities, a particular language is not just something that like an individual person does. Languages and different languages are associated with different particular places on the earth, right? So different regions have different particular languages, and the languages are integrated with the people that live in that place, the nature that lives in that place, and even the land itself, right? Such that it doesn't really make sense to pick apart a language from the reality, the place, the space in which it is spoken, or the people who speak it, right? They don't really buy into this idea that you can start dissecting language from the existence in which it is used, right? In some other belief systems, people might believe in like a sacred language or some kind of a pure language. There's lots of different versions of this idea. So for example, in the Vedic tradition in India, there's a belief that the original language of the Vedic text, the Sanskrit language, is kind of like a perfect language, that the Sanskrit language perfectly captures the nature of reality in a way that no other language can. For people that buy into this belief system, they think that other languages in India, even other languages that have descended from Sanskrit historically, are kind of just degraded forms of language that can never be as good as Sanskrit is at capturing and describing the real world as it exists, right? There's a similar attitude, or at least there was historically in Europe, to the classical languages like Latin and Greek. So for a long time, academics, scientists in Europe had this belief that the only language that was worth talking about science in was either classical Latin or classical Greek. And that was because these languages were actually just better at describing reality than other languages were, right? And you may be thinking to yourself, okay, what does it have to do with linguistic relativity? Well, if some languages are pure, perfect languages that accurately describe reality in a way that no other language can, then that means that if you don't speak those languages, you're kind of not as smart. You are not as capable of understanding the world as you are if you can speak, Greek or Latin or Sanskrit. So that's a linguistically relative ideology, right? You see almost like the opposite idea in some Asian traditions. So specifically some versions of Buddhism or Chinese Taoism have an attitude towards all language that it's all fundamentally inadequate. That language can never actually accurately tell you about the world. All it can ever do is point you towards understanding of the world. And that reality kind of exists as something that is beyond what you are able to actually speak and talk about, right? So like when you talk about a tree, the word tree doesn't actually like link up to a real thing in the world. It's just a pointer. It just points you to an idea, right? The linguistic relativity idea as we know it, right? The idea that speakers of different languages have different ways of seeing the world has its kind of recent origins in the philosophy of a group of philosophers in the post-Enlightenment period in like the 1700s, early 1800s, who are known sometimes as the Romantic Philosophers. What exactly that word means, don't worry about it. They weren't like, really sexy or anything like that. This guy specifically, this stone statue anyway, is Wilhelm von Humboldt, who wrote a lot about the idea of a group of people's Weltanschauung or their Weltansicht, which is a German word that pretty literally means world view. The idea that von Humboldt and some of his contemporaries had was that groups of people, they were not so much concerned with individuals as they were like groups of people. So like nations, right? Like German people versus French people versus Polish people versus Chinese people. The different groups of people had developed their languages based on the environments in which they existed, right? So the places that they existed and the places that people lived and their cultures had developed would determine the shape of their languages, and that the shape of their languages determined the nature of their thoughts, determined the way that they saw the world, right? So that the cultures that developed in a particular place, the culture would be reflected in the language, and the language would then in turn dictate how people that grew up with that language saw the world, that they would see it through the lens of their culture, right? This idea at the time is not so different from the modern idea of linguistic relativity. But its framing at the time, I think most people rightfully would cringe at. This idea of a Weltanschauung, of a worldview, a way of seeing the world, kind of snowballed and became part of a broader racial science, or racial pseudoscience that kind of infected Western science for a lot of the 19th and early 20th century. And the problem, with the German view of Weltanschauung and similar ideas, it wasn't just the Germans who talked about this stuff, but the problem with this idea at this time was kind of that people said, okay, well, different people speak different languages, and those different languages give them different worldviews, and that means that somebody is actually better at understanding the world than somebody else is, right? That these things were rankable, that you could look at differences in worldview, differences in perception, and that you could determine who was the, superior master race, right? Like which type of people were better than others. And of course, the Western European people who were building up this idea, of course, they thought that they were the peak of civilization, right? So this idea, this kind of Weltanschauung idea, was repeated in a different lens about 100 years later by early American anthropologists and linguists at the beginning of the 20th century. So another term for linguistic relativity that you might see out there is a term, the name the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, which is named for two linguist anthropologists from the US, Edward Sapir on the left with the glasses, and his student, one of his students, Benjamin Wharf. These two guys and some of their colleagues at the time, their contemporaries, were some of the first people to seriously study, actually have serious academic study of Native American languages in the US and Canada. And in this process of studying both these people's cultures and their languages, both of these guys, but especially Benjamin Whorf, really picked up on the idea that Native American cultures were very, very different. Native American worldviews and cosmologies were very different from a white European worldview. And that also grammatically, structurally, lexically, the languages of these people were also very, very different. And these two facts kind of like merged for these folks, and they began to repeat a version of that Weltanschauung idea that the differences in people's culture was reflected in and also reflective of the differences in their languages. So, for example, Edward Sapir said, "No two languages are ever sufficiently similar to be considered as representing the same social reality. The worlds in which different societies live are distinct worlds, not merely the same world with different labels attached," right? So the idea here is that, an English speaker talking about something that's blue and a Japanese speaker that's talking about owl and blue are just not interchangeable things at all, right? They're completely different frames of reality. They pick up on maybe the same kind of external output, but they put it together in a totally different way. And it leads to the people who talk about these things to view the things they're talking about differently. One thing that's important to understand about these guys and the formulation of this theory and their interest in promoting it was that at the time, right, these guys were writing in like the 1930s and 40s, into the 1950s. It was still extremely common for a lot of otherwise very smart people to just assume that Native American people and Native American cultures were basically completely intellectually bankrupt, right? It was very normal for people, professors at a university, to assume that Native American people were incapable of complex thoughts, and that in part maybe that was because their languages prevented them from having complex thoughts, and that their languages themselves were just simple and primitive and incapable of putting together complex ideas, right? And one of the motivating factors, one of the lenses that we have to understand this theory from this time period through, is that these guys were very interested in making sure that people understood, right, that white Europeans understood that there was a lot of intellectual complexity in Native American culture, and that there was a lot of linguistic complexity in Native American culture that needed to be appreciated, right? So for example, Benjamin Whorf said, "We shall no longer be able to see a few recent dialects of the Indo-European family as the apex of the evolution of the human mind. They and our own thought processes with them can no longer be envisioned as spanning the gamut of reason and knowledge, but only as one constellation in a galactic expanse," right? What he's saying there is that there is a whole nother like world of human understanding that exists in other cultures, and that we can't be so ethnocentrically limited, right? We're only dooming ourselves if we fail to understand how differently different people can see the world, and really appreciate that. Now, this idea, right, if you look at it from this lens, the motivation is certainly a noble one, that people, these guys wanted to change the very racist attitudes that people had towards the people that they were studying. But at the same time, there over the decades grew to be a lot of criticism of a lot of aspects of their hypothesis about the relationship between language and thought. By the kind of like 1960s, and especially once you get to like the 1970s and 1980s, the paradigm had completely shifted in linguistics and in cognitive psychology, such that the kind of standard line was that languages are all the same under the hood, right? So this guy in this picture is Noam Chomsky, who kind of led a revolution in linguistics that took on the idea that all human languages basically structurally are more or less the same thing, right? And that differences between them, things that look very different about languages, are really just kind of like surface issues, and that deep down, all languages really have the same structure, and they're all structured more or less the same in the human mind, right? This was obviously tied to a lot of other theoretical issues that Chomsky and as his colleagues were developing at the time as well. But the idea here was that they viewed language as being something essentially separate from thought, right? That language was something that you did to express your thoughts, but it was not deeply tied to the rest of your cognition, the way that the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis was putting forward. And so by, like the 1970s, 1980s, people, scholars at least, tended to look at ideas like linguistic relativity or the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis as being almost kind of like ridiculous, right? And that kind of brings us to essentially the modern period. So after several decades of people basically saying like, the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis is a bunch of bunk, it's stupid, it's maybe borders on some kind of like noble savage ideas, people kind of came back to it and started to say, well, maybe we were a little bit harsh. Maybe there is something here that is worth salvaging and worth looking into a little bit more. And there's a term that's thrown around sometimes for this re-emergence of linguistic relativity and studies on linguistic relativity that people sometimes refer to as neo-Whorfianism. So in neo-Whorfian studies, what people are focused on is experimental studies, so kind of like controlled experiments. And one of the reasons that's important is that folks like Edward Sapir and Benjamin Whorf, when they were writing about the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, or even back when Wilhelm von Humboldt was talking about the Weltanschauung of different groups of people, they were just kind of looking at differences in language and just kind of talking off the top of their head a little bit, right? I mean, they were smart guys and they had like some decent evidence, but they weren't backing it up with like controlled scientific experiments, right? They were saying, well, these people's culture is different. Well, these people's language is different. Those two things must be linked, right? Instead, what the neo-Whorfians are kind of concerned with is using experimental studies to show linguistic effects on non-linguistic cognitive behaviors. And this last piece is really important, right? The idea is that you don't want to just ask people, say like, oh, do you see blues differently? Like, do you think of these colors differently? You don't want to just give people's impressions of how their language affects their reality or the way they look at the world, right? Because then you're just asking people to express using language how language affects how they see the world, and that just gets kind of messy and doesn't really go anywhere, right? Instead, what people want to see is how differences in a person's first language might affect their cognitive behaviors that had nothing to do with language. Let me give you an example of one of these experiments. Going back to this Russian blues issue that we talked about earlier on in the presentation. So if you remember, English has one color category, blue, that in the Russian language is actually split up into two different colors, right? So kind of a lighter blue and a darker blue in Russian have two totally separate names, right? So whereas in English, they are two different versions, two different shades of the same blue color, in Russian, they are two totally different. Such that on this slide, and when you look at this gradient from a light blue to a dark blue, 0, 1, and 20 of these color swatches, for a Russian speaker, these are two different colors. For an English speaker, these are just two different blues, but for a Russian speaker, these are two totally different colors. And what this experiment wanted to test was to see if that category difference, that linguistic category difference for Russian speakers actually affected the way that they perceived color. This is how the experiment worked. Participants were shown a screen with these 3 color blocks. And there would be one color swatch on top. They would have blues in there, but they would have other colors so that participants didn't understand the point of the experiment and ruin it. But they would show them a color block like the one at the top, and then show them 2 other color blocks. One would be the exact same as the one on top, and the other would be a different, slightly different color. Now, you might look at these, and it might even take you a second to realize the difference, right? That the color on the left is the same as the color on the top, and that the one on the right is slightly lighter, right? It's a very, very minor difference in the shade. So you really have to be paying attention to the differences, right? And what they wanted to, and what they would have participants do is just click a button that said the one on the left is the same or the one on the right is the same. And what they were measuring is how quickly they were able to do that, right? So they were measuring their reaction time. And they got speakers of Russian to do it and speakers of English to do it. And what they found is that Russian speakers were in fact a little bit faster, not a whole lot faster, but statistically significant in the difference. They were a little bit faster at being able to tell the difference in these very small differences in shades of blue, especially around kind of the middle where you go from being in this light blue color category to this Russian dark blue color category. So this is the kind of thing where you actually can see non-linguistic evidence of a linguistic difference affecting how people perceive the world, right? Russians are a little bit better, or at least they're a little bit quicker at seeing the differences in shades of blue because these different blues are actually different colors for a Russian speaker. Here's another experiment that involves little pieces of trash. It takes a little bit of explaining. So Ima and Mizuka 2007 was a study that was done to look at differences in the behaviors of Japanese and English-speaking children. And what they were looking at was to see if Japanese and English-speaking children looked at objects differently and categorized objects differently based on a difference between Japanese and English grammar called a noun classifier. So in Japanese, if you want to say 2 dogs, you cannot just take the number 2, ni, and put it with the word dog, inu, like we can in English. Instead, you have to put the 2 with this little marker that marks what kind of thing you are counting. So instead of saying ni inu, you say ni biki no inu. So 2 bikis of dog. Or if you want to count 2 pencils, you might say not ni inpitsu, but nippon no inpitsu. 2 pons of pencil. Pon here is a marker, a noun classifier that's used for long, skinny objects. Biki is used for small animals. There's a pretty big inventory of these different classifiers. And you have to do this anytime that you want to count a noun. Now in English, we do something like this, but only with a small subset of nouns. So for example, if you talk about water, right, which I need a drink after talking so much. If you talk about water as a noun, you cannot count waters, right? I mean, you kind of can if you're talking about bottles of water, but in general, what we have to do is we have to say things like 1 glass of water, right? This is not 1 water, this is 1 glass of water. And that's comparable to the way that these noun classifiers are used in Japanese. It's just that with Japanese, you have to do that with every noun. Now, why do we have to do that with some nouns in English and not with other nouns in English, right? So if I have 1 mouse, I don't have to say 1 thing of mouse, right? What Ima and Mizuka would say, and what lots of people would say, is that the difference is that in English, a count noun, or sorry, a mass noun, a thing that you have to have a classifier with, that you have to say 1 glass of water, not just 1 water. These are nouns that refer to substances, right? Water is a substance that can take lots of different shapes. And so we have to define what kind of shape, what kind of vessel it's coming in, right? We do this with things like, 2 bottles of milk, 3 pounds of meat, 1 jar of dirt, right? You can't say like 2 dirts, 3 dirts. You can say 1, 2, 3 pounds of dirt, and that defines the like shape of the substance that you're talking about. But otherwise, these things are just substances, right? The argument is that because a language like Japanese has to have noun classifiers for every single noun, then that means that Japanese speakers might actually view all of these things to some degree or another as being substances, not individual things, right? When we say one mouse in English, this is a thing. We already have a defined shape. It's not a substance that can be shaped into something else, right? But because Japanese grammatically treats nouns as substances, the question is, do Japanese speakers also tend to think more about things in terms of their substance as opposed to the shape that they come in? And this is exactly the question that an experiment like Imai and Mazuka is designed to get at. So the way that this experiment worked is that Japanese and English-speaking children were given 3 trays like the ones on your screen. Here in this one, what you see is a tray that has a pile of sawdust in this omega or U shape. And then you see below it, you see the exact same shape, but instead of being made out of sawdust, it's actually made out of little tiny strips of leather. I pick kind of random substances, but it's the same shape, but it's a different substance making that shape, right? And in the third tray, you see sawdust again, like in the top tray, but it's in a totally different shape. It's just in like these 2 clumps in the corner, right? So the prediction is that since Japanese grammar tends to treat, or not tends, it does treat all nouns as substances as opposed to individual things with a particular shape, then that means that Japanese children might be more sensitive to the substance of a material than to the shape of a thing, right? And that English children that don't do this are going to think more about shape than about substance. And so what the experiment asked children to do was to say, okay, which of these 2 things on the bottom matches or is most like the thing on the top? And again, not to some like 100% perfect degree, but to a really statistically significant degree, Japanese children tended to say, well, this tray with sawdust in the 2 clumps is the same as this tray of sawdust in the U shape. Whereas English-speaking children would say, well, the 2 things that have the same shape are similar, right? And so the idea is that this shows you through a non-linguistic behavior, right, what things children choose to group together in this experiment. This shows you that a Japanese speaker is maybe a little bit more sensitive to thinking about things in terms of the substance they are made of than the shape that they take, right? One other kind of evidence that's kind of used in more recent discussions on linguistic relativity, but is kind of a little bit different, has to do with actual like fMRI studies. So you might be familiar with like a fMRI, like a brain scan image. A number of different studies of fMRI imaging involving linguistic tasks with speakers of different languages have shown that in English speakers, when an English speaker is doing some kind of linguistic task or even just like saying a word that is a noun, that it actually activates different parts of the brain than when an English speaker is using a verb, right? So nouns and verbs in English and some other related Western European languages are actually set up differently in the brain. And that if you do the same types of tests with speakers of Chinese, there is no difference between which parts of the brain are activated between noun use and verb use. So that means that in fact nouns and verbs are more different in the actual physical brains of English speakers and they are not so different in the physical brains of Chinese speakers. Now that does not necessarily mean though that linguistic processing, that difference in the way that the words are processed between the 2 languages actually corresponds to any other kind of cognitive behavior, right? Those differences that we can observe in an fMRI could just be that these different languages have different structures, but that doesn't mean that like the rest of English speaking or Chinese speaking brains work any differently, right? And that kind of brings us to a big criticism of these modern studies, right? And the kind of state of the art for linguistic relativity, which is that since this renewal of interest in studying linguistic relativity, people have done these kinds of experiments like the Russian blues experiment or the Imai-Mazuka experiment that shows that Japanese children tend to group things by substance and English speaking children tend to group things by shape. And, you know, these things are interesting. And yeah, they, you know, a lot of people will say, admit, yeah, this shows you some degree of linguistic relativity. This shows you that there may be some very minor differences in worldview or perception or cognition based on the language that somebody speaks, based on differences in the languages that people speak. But like, so what, right? Okay, so Russian speakers are a little bit quicker at determining minor differences in shades of blue in a controlled experiment. Like, does that mean they see the sky differently? Does that mean that like Russian painters can, you know, paint better with blues? So Japanese speakers, because of their language, tend to focus a little bit more on the substance of items as opposed to the shape of things. Okay. So what? I mean, what does it actually mean in material terms? Does it actually like mean that people's experience of the world is really so fundamentally different in the way that folks like Edward Sapir or Benjamin Wharf or even Wilhelm von Humboldt were suggesting that they were? A lot of modern linguists would say no. One of the complaints is that all of this renewed study has actually served to show that, on the one hand, yes, linguistic relativity is real to some degree, but on the other hand, the degree to which it can be shown to be a real thing is so minuscule that it actually shows it to be not that important, right? That, okay, there are differences in the way that different speakers of different languages see the world, but that they don't really add up to anything all that important. If we wanted to understand linguistic relativity as something that actually was meaningful in people's lives, that actually meant that you would experience the world differently, we would want to be able to see differences that were a little bit more impactful, that actually meant something more in people's day-to-day lives. And so I wanted to end here in this discussion with an example of what might be a bigger fish issue, a broader topic within linguistic relativity that might actually lead to people thinking about differences in languages actually having real substantive impacts on people's lives. And that has to do with the way that languages serve to create people's emotions. So anthropologists and psychologists for most of the 20th century had a view of emotion that there were like basic emotions. Usually there are, most versions of this, there are like 6 basic emotions, and that they are universal to all human populations, right? The basic emotions like happiness, sadness, fear, disgust, anger, surprise, that these are all like genetically built into humans, and that we all experience them, and that we all experience them in the same way. So this idea was especially promoted by a psychologist named Paul Ekman, who kind of went around the world and did this kind of experiment where he would like show people like pictures of people's facial expressions and ask them like, how does this person feel? And he said that people all said the same thing. And this was used as evidence that everyone has the same basic emotional categories and everyone understands emotions to be the same thing. But a more modern take, it's kind of taken hold within some parts of cognitive science within the last couple of decades, is an idea that actually emotions, like a lot of other things, are maybe a little bit more constructed by our social reality than they are kind of genetically imbued within us. And here's an example that's kind of interesting. Renato Rosaldo was an anthropologist who in the 1980s went with his wife Shelley to northern Luzon in the Philippines to do research with a group of people who spoke a language called Ilongot. And these Ilongot speakers, in their kind of inventory of emotion words, they had things that meant something sort of like happy and something that's sort of like sad, but they also had a kind of basic emotion that they called liget. I'm sure I'm not saying that right, but it was something like liget. That's how Rosaldo spells it anyway. Rosaldo told a story about playing a recording of a deceased Ilongot speaker to some of his friends in the village that they worked in, for study and to see how they responded to things he had said, maybe to help them translate, something like that. But he played them an audio recording of a person who was part of the community who had died. And he said that the Ilongot speakers in the room got like visibly like enraged by listening to this recording of their dead friend. He said, that their like face like tensed up and their like lips were pursing, and they looked like they were like furiously mad. And after stopping the recording and kind of backing out of the situation a little bit, he asked the guys in the village. He said, okay, so what was going on? What was the problem there? And they said that listening to this recording of their dead friend made them feel liget, which Renato Rosaldo described at the time as something that seemed like an alien emotion to him. He really couldn't understand exactly the emotional idea that was being expressed by this word liget. The way that the Ilongot speakers described it was that it was this feeling that was like a bolt of lightning, like going through your body, that you felt that you could only assuage, you could only get out of your body by like an act of violence, right? Like, like hitting somebody or like screaming at the top of your lungs. So this just like immense amount of energy, but that it was something that was triggered by things related to people who had died. So it was also related to this kind of like deep grieving sadness, right? So in a way, it's this kind of combination of like intense rage that you feel related to grief, right? And Rosaldo actually has a very interesting and really quite sad story in which he says, for the longest time, he really couldn't really understand what this word meant. And then his wife actually died in like a tragic accident in another village in the Philippines. And he described, pulling over on the side of the road shortly after she died and just needing to, get out of his car and just scream at the top of his lungs and bang on the earth. And he said, okay, now I kind of understand what the word means, right? And so this idea of liget was taken up by Rosaldo and some other anthropologists and even some cognitive psychologists as an example of a culturally specific emotional category, right? Now, the basic idea, this is not like a totally alien idea, right? It's in fact a very human idea that when you experience extreme grief, that you might also, as part of that, experience a kind of rage, right? Like an overwhelming emotion that drives you to, almost like a momentary insanity, right? That you just have like an overwhelming emotion that you can only kind of get out of your body by like banging on something or being violent in some way, right? That's not like all that weird at all, right? If you've ever experienced the loss of somebody that's very close to you, you probably have felt something sort of like that. But the point is that for these Ilongot speakers, this idea is not like a combination of lots of different ideas, right? It's a core basic emotion, and it's something that fits into a small single word like liget. So like in English, we can describe this feeling, but we need a lot more vocabulary to do it. And we're actually combining other basic vocabulary terms related to emotion in our own language, like grief and rage. And the point here is that this is a lexical difference between English and Ilongot that corresponds to an ability to think and see the world and your relationship to other people in a slightly different way, right? Emotion words don't just describe a feeling, right? The words for an emotion in a particular language relate a whole bunch of different things altogether, right? They include when you feel them, right? What are the conditions that you should feel this way in? It includes the actual like physical feeling in your body, right? Do you feel hot? Do you feel tense? Do you feel like, you know, your body's sinking down? And then they also point you to what you're supposed to do to feel better about it, right? How are you supposed to resolve it, and how are you supposed to feel about feeling that particular way, right? So when you have an emotion word in English like grief, there's not just like that's not just a feeling, right? That is a word that points you to a whole bunch of other social behaviors and social contexts that all get linked together in this one word. Grief is something that you feel when a loved one dies, or when something that you really want to happen is not going to happen. You have some sense of loss, and you're supposed to feel in grief sad and heavy and like you can't move, right? And that the way that you deal with that is that you have to accept it and then feel what you feel, and then you move on, and that it's okay to feel grief in certain periods of loss, right? A word like liget has, again, like things that are not alien to us as human beings, but it packages them in different ways, right? It says that it is very normal when somebody close to you dies to feel liget, which is a physical feeling, not of, you know, down, shrinking, but that it is a, right, an intense, violent, like rageful feeling. And that's linked to experiencing loss in your life, and that you have to get that out of you in order to move forward, right? So this is probably the kind of thing that is what people interested in linguistic relativity would most want to understand, right? This is something where, you know, okay, so changes in your perception of blue maybe don't matter all that much, but your emotional life does actually matter quite a lot, right? And so this is an instance where, you know, differences in language exist and serve to further differences in a particular culture, right? Languages are used within groups of people to help them understand how to interact with each other and with the world. And so one of the things that language can do, and differences in languages can lead to, is differences in the way that people perceive their relationships to other people, and the way that words are linked to the outside world, and what they point you to when you know, it's like with an emotion term, when you should feel something and what you should do about it, right? That words are not just like tied to one thing in reality, but that they point you to different parts of the real world. I think it's a good place to leave this for now. So linguistic relativity is a very interesting topic. It's one that a lot of people have run away with and have used to make some pretty crazy claims about the differences in worldview among different groups of people. And yeah, some of them have been kind of out there. And there are a lot of reasonable criticisms about this idea. But one thing to keep in mind is that the idea that a language can relate you to the other people that speak the language and therefore changes your interaction with the world is really important and is kind of undeniable. And that is exactly why this idea, or some version of this idea, is so important within language revitalization, and it motivates people to want to preserve the languages of their communities. So thank you.